want to know how Mark Chapon made $178,000 in 3 months?
Sí, señor. Muy buenas tardes a todos los amigos suscriptores desde tu canal. Ay, mierda, acabando de entrar y de una vez cogiendo órdenes. ¿Qué es lo que está pasando? Déjame ver. Un segundito. Ay. Hay que estar muy atentos. Déjame ver qué es lo que está pasando. Porque... Ok. Bien, porque el día de hoy, damas y caballeros, el viejito habla. El viejito habla. De hecho, se acaban de publicar los datos de los tipos de interés y los tipos de interés se han mantenido, mírenlo aquí, en 5.5%. Lo han dejado igual. ¿Será este el fin de la subida de los tipos de interés? Creo que va a ser una de las preguntas que más le van a hacer el viejito el día de hoy. Si ya no van a haber subidas, porque si el viejito dice o insinúa siquiera de que ya no van a haber más subida, la cosa se puede poner muy, pero muy loca. Así como usted lo escucha, muy, pero muy loca. Vamos a dar la bienvenida a todos los que van entrando aquí al stream. Lavan Calcaño dice activo, mae, activo, papi, así mismo, mi favorito. Ay, Dios mío, loco, saludo. Edward Chávez, John Florentino dice, ay, Dios mío. Guillermo Ceballos, ya salió el dato y ahora esperar a Powell, así es, quedan unos 20 minutos. Más o menos. Para que hable el viejito Jerome Powell. Tengo que ver de dónde que lo voy a ver. Dice, ay, Dios mío, mae, saludo de Horacio García. Miguel Ángel Moreira dice, Villalobos dice, El Salvador activo, gracias Miguel. Traba Hacienda El Prado dice, Dios me lo bendiga, mi sobrino de parte de la tía. Ay, Dios mío, cuidado con la monedita, la tía. Guillermo, hola, ¿cómo estás? Parece buena noticia para los mercados acercándose diciembre, dice Guillermo.
Dios mío, May, ay, Dios mío.
Dime, papi, ¿de dónde es que vamos a ver al viejito? Hay que buscar de dónde es que vamos a ver el discurso ese.
Óyeme, Mike.
Dime, papi.
Ese viejito casi se está muriendo.
Ay.
Y yo dije hace 6 meses atrás que yo predije este momento. ¿Tú sabes por qué?
Ay, el profeta.
Ellos están imprimiendo dinero, Mike. Adiós, van a mandar.
¿Pero y cuándo es que han dejado de imprimir, mi niño?
No, pero ya ahora van a imprimir a lo grande.
Ahora se viene la zambullida fuerte a la maquinita, a ponerla al 100%.
Exactamente. Esa maquinita va a coger fuego. Esta papeleta que van a imprimir ahí.
Ay, Dios mío, yo estoy sorprendido literalmente porque como Bitcoin...
Óyeme, son 60,000 millones que van a mandar por Ucrania.
¿Cómo?
40,000 millones. Y 40,000 millones van a mandar para Israel. Date cuenta.
Ay, Dios mío.
Paguétate.
Ay, Dios mío. La gente que vende las armas están de risita, ¿oíste? Están coronados.
Exacto. Y si se empata cualquier otro país más, van a imprimir más.
Ay, Dios mío.
Van a tener que imprimir más porque es que ellos no tienen. El gobierno federal de los Estados Unidos no tiene dinero.
Mi loco.
Y tú sabes que el dinero federal de Estados Unidos es como la gente cuando está corrupto que se echa 10 pesos en un bolsillo y gasta 15 y 20.
Totalmente.
Sin tener.
Totalmente.
Sí.
Pero ¿tú qué crees que va a pasar ahora cuando el viejito hable? Porque nosotros estamos en una parte alta, básicamente
Él no habló, él dejó la tasa de interés.
No, pero él va a hablar ahora, en unos 20 minutos,
porque
él va a hablar.
Es que la economía no aguanta más. La economía le entra más tasa de interés y la va a frenar. Cuando viene a ver, vamos para una recesión. Y entonces ellos tienen que mantener la tasa así de interés por más largo tiempo, que se alargue en el tiempo, pero no subirla más. Porque si la mete va a frenar la economía, y a frenar la economía vamos a estar en una inflación o vamos a estar en recesión. Y tú sabes que salir de una recesión no es fácil.
Loco, ¿tú sabes lo que significaría que Jerome Powell en su próximo meeting, o sea, la Fed en su próximo meeting, baje los tipos de interés? Eso sería
No lo va a bajar, ni tampoco lo va a subir, porque van a seguir imprimiendo, Mike. Te estoy diciendo.
Ay, Dios mío. Tú estás diciendo que lo van a dejar así ya estable en 5.5.
Exacto, esa maquinita van a botar fuego ahora mismo.
Dice Guillermo Ceballos que hasta 2024 no sube más nada.
Y fácilmente se le queman las manos a los que están ahí imprimiendo dinero, vamos a decir.
Un fogarate lo que se va al maíz. Ay, Dios mío, señor, el precio de Bitcoin está manteniendo la tendencial. Es una vaina increíble. Es una vaina increíble, miren. Como el día de hoy incluso ha habido volatilidad con la noticia y todo. Estas son gráficas de 4 horas. Miren el mechazo que se pegó BTC hacia arriba. Luego se lo comió todo para abajo otra vez. Y tendencial aguanta y dice, no, es que hasta aquí. Y volvemos. ¿Hasta cuándo? Porque aquí hay algo. Señores, aquí hay algo. Aquí hay un triángulo. Yo no sé, aquí hay un triángulo. También se puede ver como una bandera. Como mil cosas que usted puede ver. ¿Usted me entiende? Y esto está llegando a su final.
Óyeme, el precio de BTC ahora mismo, un par de meses, es $40,000, no menos de ahí. Eso va a subir para arriba.
Esto va a explotar para un lado.
Esos viejitos están locos por quemarse la mano imprimiendo dinero,
Dice aquí de CZ11, hola May, el mejor. Vea cómo salió para arriba y para abajo del triángulo. Y se metió de vuelta. Ay, Dios mío, una vaina increíble, brother. Yo lo que estoy chequeando es la tendencia. Que bueno, el triángulo podría ir desde la misma tendencia ahí, mira. Taca, tusca. Bello, eso está bello. Ay, Dios mío, lo único es, señores, que cuando usted activa indicadores como el índice de la fuerza relativa, el Concord. Miren, el Concord de hecho, vamos a poner en la diaria. Miren, en la diaria, Bitcoin ya está empezando a hacer divergencia bajista. Miren, el precio aquí va como que sube. Y aquí va como que baja. Y hay divergencias formándose en el RSI en la diaria, lo que indica que, bueno, si no estamos a punto, deberíamos de retroceder por lo menos. Ok, según los indicadores. Y por otro lado, el indicador de nuestro amigo Nao concorde y que veo que ha tenido una muy buena adopción en el canal, en el grupo de Telegram. Concord. Vamos a ver el Concord. Porque el Concord, señores, han habido ya varios artistas que han tocado la fiesta por aquí arriba. Quinito Méndez, Fefita la Grande, Oro Duro, Celia Cruz, que en paz descanse. Y como que la fiesta se gastó, como que se está gastando la fiesta. E incluso cuando hacemos zoom, nosotros vemos, vamos a poner aquí. Cuando hacemos zoom Concord, los que saben un poquito de Concord saben que cuando esta línea, que es la línea de la montaña, se está acercando a la línea roja, se puede venir un corte. No se ha dado, el corte, pero estamos ya en una zona, que mucho cuidado, que mucho cuidado, porque cuando se vienen estos cortes, miren, cuando se vienen estos cortes, la vaina es cataplusca, ¿verdad? Pero también hemos visto falsos cortes. O no falsos cortes, mire. Mire. Aquí la vaina de que cataplusca, mentira del diablo, toca de nuevo que la fiesta no se ha acabado. Pum, 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 pam, pam. ¿Tú me entiendes? Pero aquí había aquí había un concierto fuerte. Aquí ha habido un concierto fuerte, aquí ha habido un festival. Aquí se ha tocado mucha música ya. Estamos entonces a orillas o al borde de un retroceso. Sería justo. Yo lo veo ahí, el retroceso. No, es que para mí tiene que subir un pelín más. Allá, 37, 38. Un pelín antes de retroceder. Es decir, que ahora en la fiesta me metan el altita sorpresa, que nadie se lo estaba esperando, y venga a tocar, Aventura. Tú le llegas. Pero la vaina está pintando. Vamos a ver qué nos está diciendo otros indicadores como el MACD. Déjame ver. Ajá, ¿dónde está? Aquí, MACD. Estamos extendidísimo. Montañas en caída. Valle verde. En la diaria. Ojito, cuidado, No son momentos para estar entrando tampoco en FOMO ni en mucha locura. Pero hay un indicador que yo sí le quiero mostrar. Es un indicador que lo tenemos que ver en la semanal. Porque este indicador que yo le voy a mostrar a continuación, cada vez que ha dado la señal de ponerse en verde, la vaina se ha vuelto loca. La cosa se ha puesto muy loca. Estamos hablando del indicador CM Slingshot System. Señores, yo quiero, antes de que veamos lo que está pasando con el CM Slingshot, que veamos lo que ha pasado con el CM Slingshot. Ok. Nosotros nos vamos aquí a la gráfica cuando Bitcoin estaba en el año 2014. Ok, 2013. Nosotros vemos que el CM Slingshot venía en una tendencia alcista verde maravilloso. Y cuando empieza el año de caída e incluso ya a punto de llegar a su suelo, el CM Slingshot se torna rojo. El precio, por ende, cae por debajo del CM Slingshot. Nos volvemos bajistas. Duramos todo este tiempo bajista. Pero miren cuando el precio, miren aquí, gráfica semanal. Cuando el precio ha cruzado por encima del indicador del CM Slingshot, cuando cruza por encima del indicador, no tarda mucho en ponerse verde. Y cuando esa vaina se pone verde, la fiesta es inminente. Inminente. ¿Hasta cuándo? Hasta que vuelve a pasar lo contrario. Hasta que el precio viene y se mete por debajo del indicador, ¿verdad? Ciclo posterior, ya aquí en el año 2018, se mete por debajo del indicador el precio, ¿verdad? El indicador se torna rojo. Y ¡boom! Buscamos el suelo, año de caída. Una vez más, el precio entonces sobrepasa el indicador al alza, se nos torna poco después en verde y, bueno, simplemente cataplum, cataplum, cataplum. Aquí vino el COVID, que cruza el indicador por debajo, pero inmediatamente el precio se recupera porque esto no debió de existir. Eso no era parte del plan. El COVID no era parte del plan de Bitcoin. Y ¡pum! El precio se mete de nuevo y empieza la fiesta, hasta que nos encontramos en nuestro ciclo actual, donde vivimos el año de caída. ¿Qué pasa aquí? El indicador se mete por debajo, el precio se mete por debajo del indicador. No tarda entonces en colocarse en rojo. Buscamos el suelo y, damas y caballeros, una vez que el precio rompe por encima del indicador, el indicador no tarda en ponerse ¿en qué? En verde. No tarda en ponerse en verde. Y ahora yo te pregunto, ¿qué es lo que tiene que pasar? Porque Slingshot te dice a ti que una vez el precio se rompe, sale de su suelo, que viene el indicador en rojo, rompe al alza, se apoya, el indicador no tarda en ponerse en verde. Hace unos 3 o 4 días que estas líneas se cruzaron y el indicador se ha puesto en verde. ¿Qué es lo que usted cree? Estamos en gráfica semanal.
Óyeme, cuando se pone en verde, como tú dices, eso no para de crecer y crece y crece y crece y crece. Eso va para la luna.
Pero no significa, Carlos, que no hay retroceso, porque es que la gente se puede confundir. Estamos hablando de que esto es un indicador largoplacista, ¿ok? Exacto. Y lo que te está diciendo es que una vez esa vaina se pone en verde, todo el retroceso es para compra, porque ya tú sabes que eso no vuelve a caer por debajo del indicador. Vamos para que ustedes entiendan, miren. Vámonos otra vez para acá atrás, año 2015. El indicador se puso en verde aquí. Pero ¿dónde estaba el precio ahí? Estaba aquí arriba. ¿Qué tuvimos aquí entonces? Un retroceso. ¿Para qué? Para comprar. Porque esto te dice, el indicador te dice, yo no voy a volver a cruzarme para acá abajo. No por ahora. Y usted, si es inteligente, espera un retroceso, compra y se va con su indicador a toda. Mira aquí otra vez. Estamos por arriba, todavía seguimos verde, pero tenemos este gran retroceso. Mira cómo se frena la vaina. Usted compra y se va con su indicador a toda. En todo, ¿qué? En todo retroceso de la semanal, usted compra y se va a toda. En todo retroceso, usted vuelve y compra y se va a toda. En todo retroceso, usted vuelve y compra y se va ¿para dónde? Toda. En todo retroceso, ¿hasta cuándo? Hasta que finalizan los ciclos de Bitcoin cada 4 años. Usted vende. Espera su año de caída, espera que el slingshot se torne en rojo.
Ya que hay que comprar toda la caída que comprar.
Todo de la semanal. Pero me refiero al retroceso. No diga que tú veas que la velita está jalando un chin para abajo. No. Un retroceso.
Y aguantarla por 2 o 3 años para allá.
Pero retroceso de la semanal. Pero yo no quiero que tú me digas, que Bitcoin bajó de 34.400 a 34.000. Es un retroceso de la semanal, sicario.
Yo voy a comprar retroceso de que diario. No, es un semanal que se compra.
O sea, pero yo te estoy hablando de un indicador de la semanal que es fiable. Miren, eso fue un retroceso de ¿cuánto? De un 40%. Se compra. ¿Por qué? Porque no atravesó el CM Slingshot. Se compra. Este otro retroceso, una vez el indicador ya se había puesto en verde. ¿De cuánto fue? Este de aquí. Miren, un retroceso de un 23%. Le estoy hablando para que tú tengas la noción de qué es lo que es un retroceso de la semanal. Ok, mire, otro retroceso aquí. Pero la vaina empinada para arriba. Mira, ¿de cuánto? De un 34%. ¿Usted entiende? Para que no se me ponga friqueado cuando usted vea el retroceso. ¡Ay! Que venga un cayó un 20, un 30. No se vuelva loco. Entonces, miren, otro retroceso. ¿De cuánto? Un 34%. Ajá. Pero si usted compró.
Pero esto es para los que van a largo plazo.
Claro. Pero que mira, si usted compró cada retroceso. 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 Y está mal para venir a vender aquí arriba. No, está buenísimo. Aquí, miren, en el año donde tuvo el COVID, que el indicador, el CM Slingshot, se pone verde. Se pone verde aquí, en este punto. ¿Verdad? Nosotros estábamos por aquí. ¿Verdad? Nosotros estábamos por aquí. Entonces, usted hubiese esperado un retroceso, una compra. Bitcoin, ¿qué hace? Viene para acá, otro retroceso. Aquí empiezan los bobos. Usted compra. Aquí vino la pandemia. Dañó toda la vaina. Pero olvídese, usted tiene el indicador en verde, no se le ha puesto rojo. No se le ha puesto rojo. Retroceso en el indicador CM Slingshot después de que se pone en verde. Compra. Otro retroceso. compra. ¿De cuánto fue esa caída? De un 21%. Y así, y así, y así. ¿Hasta cuándo? Hasta acá arriba. Esto yo se lo digo, señores. Porque hay personas que me han preguntado si van tarde. Tú vas tarde si tu visión es corta. Pero si tu visión es amplia y tú tienes una proyección.
Si tu visión es más para allá de 2025, tú estás súper bien.
Tú estás coronado, manito. Porque el CM, ¿por qué vas bien? Porque el CM Slingshot es ahora que se te acaba de poner en verde. Pero tú tengas una parte alta. ¿Qué es lo que tú tienes que esperar ahora según el CM Slingshot? Un retroceso. Para usted empezar quizá a acumular de nuevo. Si tú no pudiste acumular aquí porque tú no te llevaste, que Mike te lo dijo, porque tú no me quisiste hacer caso, porque yo era un loco. Si tú no quisiste acumular en toda esta vaina, pues yo tengo para decirte que todavía el año del halving no ha llegado. Y todavía estás en el año de acumulación, pero una acumulación consciente. Una acumulación consciente. No porque el CM se puso di que en verde, ahora yo voy a comprar aquí. Usted lo puede hacer, no hay problema. Esperar los retrocesos, ya sea de aquí, ya sea de aquí, ya sea de donde sea, el retroceso, porque ya el CM Slingshot me está diciendo, que lo que con que lo que. Ya el CM Slingshot me está dando más confirmaciones. Ay, Dios mío, se me agarró una operación ahí en RNDR. Vamos, coge más, que eso le quedan pilas de órdenes todavía. Ay, Dios mío. Dice clase aquí, Mike, cuando hable el viejito, pon a BTC modo cardíaco. Avísame cuando vaya a hablar porque tenemos que estar atentos. Nada más al precio de Bitcoin. Al precio de Bitcoin. Pero no sé de qué página es que lo voy a ver al viejito. Será poner uno de los youtubers que lo esté transmitiendo para irlo viendo en la otra pantalla y poner el gráfico por la mitad. Ok, entonces CM Slingshot sigue cogiendo órdenes, coño. Vamos. Dale, coge más. Solo le faltan como 7, 8 órdenes todavía. Ok, guay. Y me pita. Sigue, no le pare. ¿Qué es lo que está haciendo Bitcoin, señores? Bitcoin está como reaccionando ahora. Gráfica de 1 hora. ¿Usted le llegó al CM Slingshot? Ay, Dios mío, pero Bitcoin está... Hay mucha volatility hoy. Déjame quitar el CM. Hay mucha volatility hoy. Mire esa vaina. Carlos, ¿cómo está despegando esa vaina en 1 hora? Vamos a ponerlo en 15. Ay, Dios mío. ¿Qué va a hacer BTC? BTC reaccionando antes de que el viejito hable, señores. BTC reaccionando antes de que el viejito hable. Gráfica diaria. Damas y caballeros, miren la volatility. Días como hoy a veces no es bueno operar. Porque al haber tanta volatilidad, mira lo que hace el precio. El precio hoy te ha subido aquí arriba y te ha bajado aquí abajo. Y ahora mismo está en el medio otra vez. Y esa diablura.
Gráfica diaria para mí ya eso ni me emociona.
¿Cuáles son las que te emocionan?
A mí me emocionan las mensuales.
Dice May, en el YouTube de Bloomberg lo puedes ver sin gente. Mándame el link para abrirlo, déjame ver. YouTube de Bloomberg. Bloomberg Live. Aquí lo encontré, déjame ver. Pero es que él está hablando ya. Él está hablando. Sí, él está hablando. Ay, Dios mío, espérate, que él está hablando. A ver.
And demand for labor, evidence of growth persistently above potential, or that tightness in the labor market is no longer easing, could put further progress on inflation at risk and could warrant further tightening of monetary policy. Financial conditions have tightened significantly in recent months, driven by higher, longer-term bond yields, among other factors. Because persistent changes in financial conditions can have implications for the path of monetary policy, we monitor financial developments closely. In light of the uncertainties and risks and how far we have come, the
Déjame
committee
ponerlo
is
en la otra,
proceeding
espérate.
carefully. We will continue to make our decisions meeting by meeting based on the totality of the incoming data and their implications for the outlook
Déjame ponerlo aquí.
and for economic activity and inflation, as well as the balance of risks. In determining the extent of additional policy firming that may be appropriate to return inflation to 2% over time, the committee will take into account which cumulative tightening affects economic activity and inflation, lags with and economic and financial developments. We remain committed to bringing inflation back down to our 2% goal and to keeping longer-term inflation expectations well anchored. Reducing inflation is likely to require a period of below potential growth and some softening of labor market conditions. Restoring price stability is essential to set the stage for achieving maximum employment and stable prices over
Precio de
the long
Bitcoin
run.
reaccionando, damas y caballeros. Vamos a
To
ponerlo.
conclude, we
Gráfica
understand
de
that our actions
una
affect
hora.
communities, families, and businesses across the country.
Vamos a
Everything we
ver.
do is in service to our
No sé ni
public
puta
mission.
idea de lo que está diciendo Jerome
the Fed will
Powell.
do
Dice
everything
Powell,
we can to
restrictive
achieve our
stance
maximum
is
employment
putting
and
down
price stability goals.
pressure on echo.
Thank you,
Maldita
and
vida.
I look forward to your questions.
No, decirle que lo traduzca.
Howard Schneider with Reuters. Thank you, Chair Powell, for doing this. To what you referenced the rise in long-term bond yields, to what degree did that supplant action by the Fed at this meeting?
Ay,
Thanks for your question. So,
le están
I'll talk about bond
preguntando
yields, but I want to take a
de la
second and
política
just sort of set the broader
restrictiva
context in which
con
we're
relación a la
looking at that. So,
inflación.
if
Vamos
you
a
look at the
ver, porque
situation,
como
let's
se
look
le
at the
zafe un
economy
peo a
first.
Jerome Powell
Inflation has been coming down,
mencionando a
but it's
Bitcoin o a
still running well
criptomoneda
above the 2% target.
o hablando de
The labor
que,
market has
de
been
que pueden
rebalancing,
reducir
but it's still very
en un
tight by
futuro
many
los tipos de
measures.
interés. Ay, Dios mío.
GDP growth has been strong, although many forecasters are forecasting, and they have been forecasting, that it will slow. As for the committee, we are committed to achieving a stance of monetary policy that is sufficiently restrictive to bring inflation down to 2% over time. And we're not
Dale,
confident
Lichavi.
yet that we have achieved such a stance. So that is the
Necesitamos un
broader
traductor
context
aquí porque el
in
inglés
which
está
this-
machucado,
the strong
machucadísimo el
economy and
mío.
all the things I said, that's the context in which we're looking at this question of rates.
Oye,
So,
y dice que tiene que
obviously,
en un
we're
futuro,
monitoring, we're attentive to the increase in longer-term
reducir
yields,
la
which have
inflación
contributed to
2%.
a tightening of
Dijo,
broader financial
vamos, Carlos,
conditions
tú
since
eres el
the
que va a
summer.
traducir entonces.
As I
Mete
mentioned,
mano.
persistent changes in
yo
broader
no.
financial conditions can have implications for the path of monetary policy. In this case, the tighter financial conditions we're seeing from higher long-term rates, but also from other sources.
A mí no me importa
the
realmente lo que él
stronger
diga, a mí lo que me
dollar
importa es lo
and
que haga
lower
el
equity prices
precio.
could matter for future
Oíste,
rate
que
decisions,
que
as long
tienen
as
mucho
two
tiempo
conditions are
para-
satisfied. The first
para
is
seguir
that the
con la
tighter
política
conditions
que
would need
tienen
to be
ahora.
persistent. And
Tienen mucho tiempo para
Y
seguir
necesita-
dejándola
y
como
that
está.
remains to
ser-
be seen.
y
But that's
necesita
critical.
ser,
If things are
consistente.
fluctuating back and forth, that's not what we're looking for. With
Está hablando
financial
entonces de que
conditions, we're looking
necesitamos
for
seguir con la
persistent
política
changes that are
restrictiva.
material. Second
Exacto,
thing is
la
that,
política, la misma política que
the
tiene.
longer-term rates that have moved up, they can't
Y
simply be a
necesitan ser
reflection of
consistentes, dice.
expected policy moves from us. That we would then, that if we didn't follow through on them, then the rates would come back down. So, and I would say on that, it does not appear that an expectation of higher near-term policy rates is causing the increase in
que la inflación
longer-term
vuelva
rates.
para atrás, sí, de
So,
manera brutal. Ellos
in
tienen
the
que
meantime,
mantenerse.
though, perhaps
Están
the most
conscientes de que
important
están en un
is
círculo
higher
vicioso,
treasury
eh.
yields are showing through to higher borrowing costs for households and businesses, and those higher costs are going to weigh on economic activity to the extent this tightening persists. And, the mind's eye goes to the 8%, near 8%.
Bueno, Jerome Powell dijo que lo van a dejar como está, sin aumentos.
So that's how I would answer your question.
Just as a quick follow-on to be clear on this, in your opening statement and just now, you seem to imply that you are not yet confident that financial conditions are restrictive enough to finish the fight. Is that true?
Yes, that's exactly right.
Dice que
To say it a different way, we haven't made any
que-
decisions
¿cómo
about future meetings. We have not made a determination,
Que si
and we're not.
eso
I will
es
say
real,
that we're not
de que-
confident at this time that we've reached such a stance. We're not confident that we haven't. We're not confident that we have, and that is the way we're going to be going into these future meetings.
Él dice
Is
que
to
no-
be,
que
just
no está
determining
seguro
the
si
extent of
la-
any additional further policy tightening
si,
that may
si
be
puede volver
appropriate to
para atrás
return
la
inflation to
inflación
2% over
o
time.
no. Pero que están tomando la vaina adecuada.
Sí,
La
como
política
siempre,
actual.
maldita fe del diablo.
Hi, Chair Powell. Thank you so much for taking our questions. I wonder, if you don't raise interest rates in December, would the presumption be that at that point that we should expect that rates are at their peak, or is there a possibility of restarting rate increases next year?
BTC reaccionando a la baja, señores.
A more extended pause.
Ella dice que si...
So, let me start by saying we haven't made a decision about September. You're asking a hypothetical there, but we're going into the December meeting. We'll get...
Are you wondering how much it will cost you to start up a company in Dubai
or
anywhere in the UAE?
Okay.
Some data on economic activity, and so we'll be taking, and also the broader situation, the broader financial conditions situation, and the broader world situation. We'll be looking at all those things as we make a decision in December. We haven't made that decision. I would say, though, that the idea that if you the idea that you would be difficult to raise again after stopping for a meeting or two is just not right. I mean, the committee will always do what it thinks is appropriate at the time. And again, we haven't made any decisions.
Jerome Powell se está manteniendo firme en la decisión de continuar con su política restrictiva. No quiere avanzar datos del futuro, como siempre.
Nick Timmeros of the Wall Street Journal. Chair Powell, did the Fed staff put a recession back into the baseline forecast in the materials for today's meeting? And how much does this tightening in financial conditions substitute for rate hikes if the tightening is persistent? You had said it was worth maybe a quarter point when we had the bank failures in the spring. What is it here on something that's presumably more straightforward and more familiar to simulate?
So I guess I don't want to answer your question about the recession, but the answer is no. I think I have to answer it since we did publicly saying that you'll know anyway. The staff did not put a recession back in. I mean, it would be hard to see how you would do that if you look at the activity we've seen recently, which is not really indicative of a recession in the near term. In terms of how to think about translation into rate hikes, I think it's just too early to be doing that. And the main reason is we just don't know how persistent this will be. You can see how volatile it is.
La recesión ya pasó, señores. Ustedes la vivieron y no se dieron cuenta.
Any kind of an estimate that was, precise would hang out there and have a great chance of looking wrong very quickly. So I think what we can say is that financial conditions have clearly tightened, and you can see that in the rates that consumers and households and businesses are paying now. And over time, that will have an effect. We just don't know how persistent it's going to be, and it's tough to try to translate
que hay que esperar a ver cómo estemos en X tiempo para tomar la decisión de ese momento. Evidente, Jerome Powell no se va a embarrar.
What makes you confident that tighter financial conditions will slow above-trend growth when 500 basis points of rate hikes, QT, and a minor banking crisis have not thus far?
Well, that's the way our policy works is, and sometimes it works with lags, of course, which can be long and variable. But ultimately, if you raise raise interest rates, you do see those effects, and you see those effects in the economy now. You see what's happening in the housing market. You're seeing that now. You'll
Dice David Suárez, papi, hazme caso, esto va a reventar. Mira la actitud de Jerome moviendo las manos. Él siempre que da un discurso malo no se mueve. Lo contrario, a hoy, que se mueve mucho. Explicando todo en detalle. Bitcoin to the moon, dice.
This has been a resilient economy.
Vamos a tener un analista de estos.
Resilience, and there are a number of possible reasons why
Millonario, dice Kumbay.
Our job is to achieve maximum employment and price stability, and so we take the economy as it comes. It has been resilient. So
BTC indeciso en el momento actual, señores. Gráfica de 15 minutos.
Colby Smith with the Financial Times. In terms of the thresholds that you've laid out of what could warrant further tightening, the additional evidence of persistently above trend growth or some kind of reversal in the recent easing of labor market tightness, that seems to suggest something more powerful than just one more quarter point rate hike would be necessary. And I'm just curious if that's
Ninguno de eso le han sacado nada a Jerome Powell.
So we've identified those factors. Those were not meant to be the only factors or a specific test that we're going to be applying with some metrics behind it. Really, we're going to be looking at the broader picture. And what's happening with our progress toward the 2% inflation goal. Is the labor market
Jerome Powell está tan entrenado para darte una respuesta sin respuesta.
Balance. We'll be looking at that. growth, we look at growth insofar as it has implications for our two mandate goals. We look at that, and we look at broader financial conditions. So we'll be looking at all of those things as we reach a judgment, whether we need to further tighten policy. And if we do reach that judgment, then we will further tighten policy.
Okay, and just in terms of the tightening of financial conditions, if that is having some kind of offsetting effect in terms of the need to potentially, again, raise rates, what then is the potential impact on the trajectory of rate cuts? Could we see
Claro,
those
Jerome
maybe
Powell
pulled
todo según los
forward or
datos,
have to
según los
see,
datos que se vayan
more
arrojando.
than what the September SEP indicated?
So it's the fact is the committee is not thinking about rate cuts right now at all. We're not talking about rate cuts. We're still very focused on the first question, which is, have we achieved a stance of monetary policy that's sufficiently restrictive to bring
Vamos a poner
inflation
aquí
to 2%?
abajo el SP500.
That is the question we're focusing on. The next question, as you know, will be, for how long will we remain restrictive? Will policy remain restrictive?
Vale.
And what we said there is that we'll keep policy restrictive until we're confident that inflation is on a sustainable path down to 2%. That'll be the next question. But honestly, right now, we're really tightly focused on the first question. The question of rates cuts just doesn't come up because I think the first, it's so important to get that first question, as close to right as you can.
El SP500 es el de abajo.
Steve Leisman, CNBC. Mr. Chairman, I guess I had assumed that there was a tightening bias in the committee. You say in the statement you're looking to assess the appropriate stance of monetary policy, the extent to which you may need to hike additionally. You didn't say earlier that you were sufficiently restrictive. There were forecasts for 2 rate
Una
hikes
maldita
among most
Mariala de
members
Jerome
of the
Powell,
committee.
manito.
But then you just said
Todo
that,
según los datos, todo según lo que venga.
Would you say the
Ahora
bias
mismo
right
nada,
now
seguimos como
is
seguimos.
neutral, that there is
BTC
no
retrocediendo,
disposition to hike
el
again, and that the
SP500
committee
haciendo
largely has moved
mucha
off of
similitud,
this
BTC
forecast for 2
queriendo
hikes?
retroceder más, gráfica de 15 minutos, vamos a
I
ver.
think you're talking about one additional.
Sigue enfrascado en el triángulo, no ha pasado nada fuera de lo normal. Tremenda vela del SP500 bajando con fuerza.
Policy firming that may be appropriate to
Junto a
return inflation
BTC.
2% over time. That's the question we're asking.
So is it right to think of that as a hiking bias is still in the committee?
Vamos a
We
ver
haven't used that term.
si es
but
que va a volver a
it's fair to say that's the
soportarse
question
sobre
we're
la
asking.
tendencial o sobre el triángulo,
It's not,
o si
you know,
definitivamente
that
lo va
is
a
the
romper.
question. You're right that in September we wrote down one additional rate hike, but we'll write down another forecast, as you know, in December.
Todo en diciembre, veremos en diciembre.
Thank you, Chris Rugaber at Associated Press.
Hablamos en diciembre, según él. Como estemos en diciembre, hablamos en
Since the last meeting,
diciembre.
the auto workers strike has finished. Oil prices have leveled off. And yet, on the other hand, you have the outbreak of war between Israel and Hamas. How do you see all those factors taken together
Metieron pa' la
affecting the
guerra ahora.
economy going forward? How are you thinking about those?
¿Qué piensa
So
sobre los
there are
combustibles?
significant issues out there.
Por la
As
guerra
you
entre
point
Israel
out,
y Palestina.
global geopolitical tensions are certainly elevated, and that goes for the war in Ukraine. It goes for the war between Israel and Hamas. We're monitoring that. Our job is to monitor those things for their economic implications. So the UAW strike, as you point out, is appears to be coming to an end.
Aquí era en modo
Oil prices have flattened out.
cardíaco,
They
un
haven't gone
minuto.
down, but I guess they've gone down a little bit from their
Modo
earlier peak.
cardíaco, un minuto.
Another one is the possibility of government shutdown. We don't know about that one.
Pues se pega un
So there's
lineazo.
plenty of risk out there. But I would go back to the bigger picture from our standpoint is we've got a very strong economy, strong labor market, making progress on the labor market, making progress on inflation, and we're very focused on getting confident that we have.
Así mismo es, cuando estemos en diciembre hablamos en marzo, en marzo en 3 meses más y así.
Great. And just one quick thing. You last month had gone to York, Pennsylvania, where you talked to a lot of, last month, where you
SP500
talked to a lot of
subiendo
small
con
business
fuerza,
owners.
gráfica de un
Just
minuto,
curious,
damas y
what sentiments
caballeros,
did you hear
reaccionando.
from
Vamos a
them,
ver
or
si es
what did you pick
sostenida la
up on?
reacción.
And what was there anything that surprised
BTC
you
le quiere
about
seguir
in
el
terms of what they
paso.
talked about?
I wouldn't say I was terribly surprised. I was very impressed by York as a town with a real strategy, and I would say it's very impressive what the people there have put together in the face of some difficult longer run trends about offshoring of manufacturing and that kind of thing.
Yo quiero que me
They've
tiren
done
una
a
vela que
great
me
job
rompa la pantalla.
as a city, I think. what you hear, and is consistent there, which is people are really suffering under high inflation. You were there. We talked to some people who, were feeling that in their businesses, and other people who were feeling it in their home lives as well. It's painful for people, particularly people who, who don't have a lot of extra financial resources, who are spending most of their income on the essentials of life. So we know that wasn't new, but that did come through very clearly in the conversation we had in New York. And I walked away from that even, just thinking that we
básicamente dijo como que no cree que afecte en gran medida con relación a los combustibles la guerra.
Fully restore price stability and not fail in that task, and do it as quickly as possible, but also with the least damage we can.
Hi, Chair Powell. Rachel Siegel from the Washington Post. Thanks for taking our questions. You've spoken before about the pain that would likely be coming for the economy in order to get inflation down. But since the economy has not responded to rate hikes in ways that would normally be expected, have you changed your views on that at all, on how necessary or inevitable that kind of pain would be?
Pero esta tipa es atrevida. Ella le está diciendo que la economía no está respondiendo.
Well, I think everyone has been very gratified to see that we've been able to achieve, pretty significant progress on inflation without seeing the kind of increase in unemployment that has been very typical of rate hiking cycles like this one. So that's a historically unusual and very welcome result. And the same is true of growth. We've been saying that we need to see below potential growth, and growth has been strong, but yet we're still seeing this. I think I still believe, and my colleagues, for the most part, I think still believe that it is likely to be true. It is still likely to be true, not a certainty, but likely that we will need to see some slower growth and some softening in the labor market conditions to get to fully restore price stability. So, but it's only a good thing that we haven't seen it, and I think we know why. Since
Suéltenmele una pregunta relacionada con cripto. Ay, Dios mío.
Processes at work here. One of which is the unwinding of the distortions to both supply and demand from the pandemic and the response to the pandemic. And the other is restrictive monetary policy, which is moderating demand and giving the supply side time to recover, time and space to recover. So you see those two forces now working together to bring down inflation. But it's that first one can bring down inflation without.
En lo que Jerome Powell ha hablado, a mí se me han ejecutado unas cuantas operaciones, han dejado muy poquito profit, pero bueno, ahí vamos. Y se me acaba de abrir en Near ONA.
It's getting, a significant increase in the size of the labor market now, both from labor force participation and from immigration.
Near Protocol llegando a Son. Uy, sigue tomando.
Really
vamos a ver, o tomó, ya la sacó.
Part of why GDP is so high is because we're getting
tomó
that
otra, se devolvió.
So we welcome that. But I think those things will run their course, and we're probably still going to be left, we think, and I think, we'll still be left with some ground to cover to get back to full price stability, and that's where monetary policy and what we do with demand is still going to be important.
Against that backdrop, if you've gotten any clarity on lags, if you have an economy that's been so resilient to high rate increases, does that suggest to you that there isn't necessarily this huge wave of tightening that's still coming through the pipeline and that it may have already come into effect?
I continue to think it's very hard to say. So it's been 1 year at this meeting. 1 year ago, this was the fourth of our 75 basis points hikes. So that's a full year since then. I think we are seeing the effects of all the hiking we did last year, and this year we're seeing it. It's very hard to know exactly what that might be. But you can, for example, an example of where you wouldn't have felt this yet is debt that had been termed out. But it's going to come due and have to get rolled over next year or the year after. So, and there are little things like that where the effects are just taking time to get into the economy. So I think we have to make monetary policy under great uncertainty about how long the lags are. I think trying to get a clear answer and say, I'm just going to assume this is a really
¿Cómo es, Carlos, que
good way to do
toma
it.
tiempo?
And this is one of the reasons why we have slowed the process down this year, was to give
En verse reflejado los resultados.
time to get into the economy. And it takes time, we know that, and you can't rush it. So slowing down is giving us, I think, a better sense of how much more we need to do if we need to do more.
Michael McKee from Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm trying to connect the dots here. One quick clarification I want to ask about Rachel's question is, you said you need slower growth. You had always said before a period of lower than trend growth. Has that changed? And two, it sounds to me like you're basically saying here that the dot plots out the window, that every meeting is live with the possibility of a rate increase for right now. Doesn't matter about the turn of the year, and that there's not an objective way to determine whether or not you've got enough tightening in the system. It's just going to be a subjective judgment meeting by meeting.
Well, so let's talk about the dot plot first. So the dot plot is a picture in time of what the people in the committee thinks is likely to be an appropriate monetary policy in light of their own personal economic forecast. In principle, when things change, that's not like a plan that anybody's agreed to or that we will do. That's a forecast that would change, for example. I mean, many things could change that would cause people to say, I wouldn't write down that dot 6 weeks later. Think of the number of things that could change your mind on that. So I think the efficacy of the dot plot probably decays over the 3-month period between that meeting and the next meeting. But nonetheless, it's out there, and we do personally update our forecast, but we don't formally update the dot plot. So, I think we try to be as transparent as we can about the way we're thinking about these things. We're laying out there our thinking, and as we approach the meeting, we'll all be, my colleagues and I will be talking about how we're processing that data. In terms of, we're not really changing the way, in terms of growth, what I said was below potential. So what you have here recently is growth that is temporarily, potential growth is elevated for a year or two right now over its trend level. So the right way to think about it is what's potential growth this year. People think trend growth over a long period of time is a little bit less than 2%, or I would say just around 2%. But what we've had is with the,
puntos importantes de los cuales la Fed, Jerome Powell ha hablado el día de hoy. Punto 1, es difícil traducir en cuánta subida de tasa se traducen en las condiciones financieras más estrictas. Punto número 2, en este momento no estamos pensando en recortes de tasas de interés en absoluto. Ok, punto número 3. Si lo consideramos necesario, endureceremos aún más la política monetaria. Bien, estamos escuchando a Jerome Powell.
But if you could clarify what I asked about the meeting by meeting.
También dijo Jerome Powell que no han tomado ninguna decisión actualmente sobre las próximas reuniones o decisiones sobre reuniones en el futuro.
Criteria rather than objective at each meeting.
I don't know that I want to just accept anybody's characterization of it. I'll tell you how we're doing this. So we're going meeting by meeting. We're asking ourselves whether we've achieved a stance of policy that is sufficiently restrictive to bring inflation down to 2% over time. That's the question we're asking. We're looking at the full range of economic data, including financial conditions and all of those things that we look at. And then we've come very far with this rate hiking cycle, very far. And you saw the spread at the September meeting of, it's a relatively small spread of people think 1 or 2 additional hikes. So you're close to the end of the cycle. That was an impression a belief as of September. It's not a promise or a plan of the future. And so we're going into these
Jerome Powell también ha dicho en el discurso en el día de hoy que hubo algunos meses de datos positivos, pero el proceso de llevar la inflación al objetivo continúa. Que si unos datos sólidos pudiesen poner en riesgo el progreso sobre la inflación, podemos ajustar más. Y las puertas quedan abiertas.
Thanks. Hi, Chair Powell. Neil Irwin with Axios. In light of the run-up in long-term yields that we've seen the last several weeks, have you given any consideration to the pace of your asset runoff program? And if there were a judgment that the higher term premium was endangering the dual mandate goals, would that be reason to think about slowing or suspending QT, or should we think of that as more of a technical question around reserves?
So, committee is not considering changing the pace of balance sheet runoff. It's not something we're talking about or considering. And I know there are many candidate explanations for why rates have been going up, and QT is certainly on that list.
Están entrando BTC,
small effect, although I would
se
say
están moviendo unos cuantos
$3.3 trillion in reserves.
Actualmente,
I think it's hard to make a
de
case.
Kraken acaban de salir 386 Bitcoin.
So that's not something that we're looking at right now.
Victoria.
Hi, Victoria Guido with Politico. I wanted to ask about the Basel III endgame capital proposal. You've got a lot of
SP500 reaccionando con fuerza
of the proposal, and you yourself
al alza BTC dubitativo.
I'm just curious, could you accept finalizing that proposal without significant changes?
So that proposal is out for comment, and we expect a lot of comment. We won't get those comments until the end of, well into next year. We've extended the deadline, and we'll take them seriously. We'll read them. I'll say what I do expect is that we will come to, we're a consensus-driven organization, we'll come to a package that has broad support on the board.
So is broad support
SP500 empepinándose, señores, BTC cayendo, vaya relación.
Janelle Marte with Bloomberg. So, in addition to persistence, when you look at long-term treasury yields, what else are you watching to
Powell dijo
evaluate
que
how
hemos
those
recorrido
tighter
un largo
financial
camino
conditions
con
are
este
hitting the
ciclo de
economy,
subidas de
and if it will
tasas y que
lessen
están
enough for
cerca
further
del
tightening?
final del
Also, do you
ciclo.
think
¡Ay,
that
Dios
those higher
mío!
yields
Mira
could
cómo
affect,
se puso el SP500 después que Jerome dijo eso.
So what do we look at? We look at a very wide range of financial conditions. And in fact, as you'll know, different organizations publish different financial conditions indexes, which can have 7 or 8 variables, or they can have 100 variables. So
Están a punto de culminar su ciclo. Ay, Dios
we tend to
mío.
look at a few of them. I'm not going to give you the names, but there are a few of the common ones.
Y el
that people look at.
SP500 le gustó
And so
la
they're looking at things like
noticia.
the level of the dollar, the level of equity prices, the level of
Le
rates,
gustó la
credit
noticia.
spreads.
Ay, lo cerré sin querer. Sorry. Señores, lo he cerrado sin querer. ¿Dónde está? Biblioteca. Historial.
Of the major standard financial condition indexes. Your second question was
On the banking stress.
banking stress. So it's something we're watching. As you know, we did have there were issues with interest rate risk and also funding uninsured deposits in the things we went through in March and thereafter. And so we've been working a lot with financial institutions to make sure that they have good funding plans and that they have a plan for how to deal with the kind of portfolio unrealized losses that they have. We do think the banking system is quite resilient. We had a handful of bank failures. So that's what we're out there doing, and we don't have any reason to think that these rate hikes are materially changing that picture, which is one of a strong banking system and one where there's a strong focus by banks and by supervisors on liquidity, on funding, and those sorts of things.
Le van a proveer liquidez a los bancos.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Scott Horsley from NPR. Last week, you and your colleagues put forward a proposal to lower the cap on debit card swipe fees for comment. Could you just talk a little about the considerations there, what it would mean for merchants, for banks, for consumers, and also just what y'all are seeing in terms of the use of both debit and credit cards in the payment system?
So you're right. We put a proposal out for comment is what we did. And, this is a job that Congress assigned us, as you of course know, in Dodd-Frank, and all we can really do is faithfully implement the statute. That's all we can really do. It's a 90-day comment period. We typically don't comment on these things once they're out for comment, and we do hope that stakeholders, and we know that they will use this opportunity to explain.
Zapier just integrated with OpenAI, and this is going to change the game for businesses. And
Jerome dijo también, señoras y señores, estamos ante un Jerome Powell muy dovish, ¿ok? Con cero intenciones de subir más las tasas.
Inflation was at 3.4%, core well over 3%. You've said in the past 2% remains the Federal Reserve target, but with no rate increase today, how long would you be okay then with a 3% or 3% plus overall inflation?
You know, the progress is probably going to come in lumps and be bumpy, but we're making progress. You know, I think the core PCE came down by almost 60 basis points in the third quarter. So if you, the best thing I could point you to would be the September SEP, where the expectation was that inflation by the end of next year on a 12-month trailing basis would be well into the twos, and the year after that further into the twos. So that's if you look historically, that's sort of consistent with the way inflation comes down. It does take some time. And as you get, as you get further and further from those highs, it may actually take longer.
Parece que al SP500 sí le gustó la noticia hoy.
We're making progress, and monetary policy is restrictive, and we feel like we're on a path to make more progress, and it's essential that we do.
Well, you've said in the past that doing too little on interest rates could take years to fix, but the cost of doing too much could be easily fixed. How robust was the debate about this pause on the doing too little side?
That's always the question we're asking ourselves, and we know that if we fail to restore price stability, the risk is that expectations of higher inflation get entrenched in the economy, and we know that that's really bad for people. Inflation will be both higher and more volatile. That's a prescription for misery. And so we're really committed to not letting that happen. For the first year or so of our tightening cycle, the risk was all on the side of not doing enough. We've come far enough that the risks have gotten more two-sided. You can't identify that with a lot of precision, but it does feel like the risks are more two-sided now. But we're committed to getting inflation back down to our target over time, and we will.
Nosotros vamos a conseguir bajar la inflación.
Simon Rabinovich with The Economist. Quick follow-up to the question about banking stresses. You talked about how the banking system is resilient. Of course, part of the resilience of the past year stems from the bank term funding program that you launched in March. Given that bond prices have not recovered, that unrealized losses are probably mounting, how likely is it that you might have to extend that program in March next year?
Good question. We haven't really been thinking about that yet. It's November 1, and that's a decision we'll be making in the first quarter of next year.
Okay. Sorry, quick second question about inflation expectations. The Michigan Sentiment Survey showed a big jump in one-year ahead inflation expectations last month from 3.2 to 4.2. Last year, you said that particular survey was a really decisive factor in one of your rate hike decisions. If it stays elevated next time around, how big of an input will that be into your December thinking?
Yeah, we look at a range of things. I think the UM thing got blown out of proportion a little bit. It was actually a preliminary estimate that got revised away, and I said it was preliminary in that, but that didn't get picked up. So we look at many things, and so really look across the broad array of surveys and also market-based estimates, and we do that really carefully at every meeting and between meetings. And it's just clear that inflation expectations are in a good place. The public does believe that inflation will get back down to 2% and it will. They're right. So and there's no real crack in that armor. You can always find one reading that is a little bit out of whack, but honestly, the bulk of them are just very clear that the public believes that inflation will come down, and that's, of course, we believe that's critical in winning the battle.
Hi, Chair Powell. Megan Casella with Barron's. Thanks for taking our questions. I wanted to see if you could talk about the neutral rate. You mentioned today that you're still debating whether rates are sufficiently restrictive, and you've recently said that evidence is suggesting policy is not too tight right now. I was curious if you could elaborate on that at all and whether that means the neutral rate, in your view, has risen.
Yeah. So first thing to say is that it's very important. It's a very important variable in the way we think about monetary policy, but you can't identify it with any precision in real time, and we know that. So you have to just take that. You have to take your estimate of it with a grain of salt. What we know now is, within a range of estimates of the neutral rate, policy is restrictive. And it's therefore putting downward pressure on economic activity, hiring, and inflation. So we do talk about this. There's not any debate or attempt to agree as a group on whether our star has moved or not. Some people think it has. Some people haven't said that don't think it has. Ultimately, it's unknowable, and so really, again, what we're focused on is looking at the data and giving ourselves a little more time now to look carefully at the data by being careful in our moves.
Pero, profe, ¿qué gráfica que tú estás viendo? De que vete en 33, 32, 31, 30. ¿Y qué gráfica que él está viendo?
Pero muy bien.
I think, years from now, economists will be revising their estimates of R star as it existed on November 1, 2023. We can't really wait for that in making policy. We have to look. We have to have those models and look at them and think about them. And ultimately, we've got to look at the effects that policy is having, accounting for the lags, which makes it difficult.
If I could follow up on a wages point earlier, you talked about the inflation outlook, but I'm curious if you have any concerns whether wage inflation at its current level could risk pushing up overall inflation or reacceleration.
So if you look at the broad range of wages, they have wage increases have really come down significantly over the course of the last 18 months to a level where they're substantially closer to that level that would be consistent with 2% inflation over time, making standard assumptions about productivity over time. So it's much closer than it was. And that's true.
Más cerca, es verdad.
Which is the one that we got this week. It's true of
es verdad. Hay que dársela ahí ayer.
Per hour too. So, and all of them are kind of saying that, which is great. And you have to look at a group of them because any one of them can be idiosyncratic in any given reading. So that's
¿Considera usted que Jerome Powell ha hecho un buen trabajo, que la SEC ha hecho un buen trabajo
if you look back comes out
ante la crisis?
If you look back a couple of quarters, you'll see it was much higher, and then it came down substantially in June. And then the September reading was more or less at the same level as the June.
Esta pregunta es para la gente del chat.
Validating that decline. And it was very close to our expectations internally, too. So
I
think we feel good about that. Also, I would say it isn't, in my thinking, it's not the case that wages have been the principal driver.
Yo voy a poner aquí la gráfica de SATS, no la del SIP. Yo voy a poner la gráfica de SATS.
I do think it's fair to say that as we go forward, as monetary policy becomes more important relative to the supply side issues.
En 4 horas.
Unwinding.
Ay, Dios mío. Ay, Dios mío.
Becomes more important over time.
Millonario.
Dejémosla ahí para el halving a ver cuánto nos da eso.
La nueva Chiva Inu. Con todo lo que acabele.
Overshooting and raising interest rates too much as you are about getting inflation down to the 2% target?
So, as I mentioned, I think for much of the last year and a half, the concern was not doing too much, not doing enough. It was not getting rates high enough in time to avoid having inflation expectations, higher inflation expectations become entrenched. So that was the concern. I think we've reached
Punto importante que ha hablado Jerome Powell también ha dicho las proyecciones de septiembre en la que indicamos tasas más altas en diciembre no son una promesa. Avanzamos con cautela.
And I think that the risks are getting more balanced. I'll just say that they're getting more balanced. The risk of doing too much.
Recuerden que en septiembre Jerome Powell había
because policy is clear, I think clearly
dejado entredicho como que en diciembre
that range,
las tasas serían más altas.
Mainstream estimate of the expected inflation, take 1 year inflation, you're going to see a real policy rate that is
Jerome Powell ha dicho también que claramente las expectativas de la inflación están en un buen lugar actualmente. Las expectativas.
I would say that we're in a place where those risks are getting closer to being in balance.
And you said the proof is how the economy reacts. What are you looking at to be sure you're not overshooting?
Estamos cerca y en balance.
Well, I think what we're looking at is, is inflation still broadly cooling? Is it sort of validating the path we saw over the summer, where inflation was clearly cooling and coming down? Now, we've seen periods like that before, and there hasn't been follow-through. The data have bounced back. So what are we seeing? Are we seeing, is inflation still coming down? So that's the first thing. Second thing is, in the labor market, what we've seen is a very positive rebalancing of supply and demand, partly through just much more supply coming online, and with labor demand still clearly remaining very strong. When you have the kind of job growth we've had over the last quarter, it's still very strong demand. So, and you see wage increases coming down, as we discussed.
Yo creo que sí también.
Coming down.
Creo que el viejito
in a kind of gradual way.
Ha sobrellevado la situación
that's what we want to see.
De buena
that
forma.
Whole set of processes
y eso es lo que
continue.
nosotros queremos ver. Eso es lo que nosotros queremos ver.
Thank you. Brian Mena, CNN. Do you think that has been any structural change in either consumption or in the job market that's pushing up consumption? You obviously saw the third quarter GDP figures, which were strong, and some economists have expected revenge spending to have fizzled out by now. So I'm kind of wondering if there's been any structural change in consumption.
I wouldn't say there's been a structural change in consumption. I would say it's certainly been strong. And so a couple of things. We may have underestimated the balance sheet strength of households and small businesses, and that may be part of it. There may be, we've been, like everyone else, trying to estimate the amount of savings that households have from the pandemic when they couldn't spend on services really at all, or in-person services. And there can still be more of that than we think. Although at a certain point we're going to be getting back to pre-pandemic levels of savings. We may not be there yet. So clearly people are still spending. The dynamic has been really strong job creation, with now wages that are higher than inflation in the aggregate anyway. And that raises real disposable income, and that raises spending, which continues to drive more hiring. And so you've had that whole dynamic has been, and also at the same time, the pandemic effects are wearing off, so that goods availability, automobile availability is better, or was better. I think it still is. And from a business standpoint, there are more people to hire, and there's more labor supply. So the whole thing has led to more growth, more spending, and that kind of thing. And it's been good. And the thing is, we've been achieving progress on inflation in the middle of this. So it's been a dynamic. The question is, how long can that continue? And I just think the existence of this second set of factors at this time, which is the unwinding of the pandemic effects, that's what makes this cycle
Entonces que en ese chat hay uno endemoniado de que vendan Solana, vendan Solana, vendan Solana.
That took longer for the process to begin than we thought, and we're still learning about how it plays out. That's all we can do.
Míralo. Vendan Solana, vendan Solana.
Daniel Davis from Agence France Presse. Just a quick question following up on an earlier one. With regards to the Israel-Hamas conflict, the Fed's Financial Stability Report said the Israel-Hamas conflict and the conflict in Ukraine pose important risks to global economic activity, including the possibility of sustained disruptions to regional trade and commodities. You've had organizations like the World Bank warning of a possible surge in oil prices if the war spreads to other countries in the region. I'm just wondering how the Fed is monitoring these developments in the Middle East. You mentioned they are, and just what the potential economic impact could be if the conflict does spread to other countries in the region. Thank you.
I wouldn't want to speculate too much, but I'll just say so. Really, the question there
Déjame yo
is, does
poner en el
the war
chat.
spread more widely, and does it start to
Compren
do things like affect oil prices in particular, since this is the Middle East we're talking about? The price of oil has really not reacted very much so far.
Sell Solana
And, as the Fed,
and
as
buy
the Federal Open Market Committee, our
sats.
job is really to talk about, to understand
Sats
the economy and
to
the
the
economic effects. And
moon.
it isn't clear at this point that the
tú entiendes
conflict in the Middle East
economía, no es
is
tan
going
claro.
is on track to have significant economic effects. That doesn't mean it isn't incredibly important and something for people to take great, really important notice of. But it may or may not turn out to be something that matters for the Federal Open Market Committee as an economic body. But what the Financial Stability Report does is it calls out risks, and that's what it's doing, is calling out a risk of that. And the war in Ukraine, the same. War in Ukraine, did have immediately very significant macroeconomic implications because of the connection to commodities. So, thank you. Thanks very much.
That was Fed Chair Jay Powell speaking for almost an hour, for 50 minutes. This is the Fed decides on Bloomberg Television, on Bloomberg Radio. Tom Keene, was done off today. And really, I've got to just go straight to the markets. What the Fed said is we don't have any decisions about any further rate hikes. What the market heard is you're done. And you can see a rally in bonds. You're seeing a rally in stocks extending to session highs on the S&P, up more than 1%. The NASDAQ gains of 1.6%. The two-year yield firmly below 5%, Tom. That caught my attention at a time when the Fed is trying to parse through nuance and the market only hears one thing.
The moves are so correlated and so
Bueno,
abrupt,
ahí finalizó. Vamos a resumir de nuevo lo que ha dicho de importancia Jerome Powell, varios puntos importantes que realmente para mí no son nada importantes porque no ha dicho nada, o sea, ha dejado todo como que vamos bien.
Disculpe por la traducción, yo sé todo lo que dice, pero para traducirlo rápido así se me hace difícil.
No hay problema, Carlos, metiste mano ahí. Jerome Powell, cosas importantes. Hubo algunos meses de datos positivos, pero el proceso de llevar la inflación al objetivo continúa. Esto que él ha dicho deja una ventana de posibilidad porque no te dice, mira, hasta aquí frenamos los tipos, deja puertas abiertas y básicamente lo que te está diciendo Jerome Powell es que básicamente todo va a depender de cómo transcurra los datos en base a lo que ellos están haciendo. De ahí es que ellos toman su decisión. Dice, dijo que si unos datos son sólidos, pudiesen poner en riesgo el progreso sobre la inflación y que pueden ajustar aún más. También dijo Jerome Powell que no han tomado ninguna decisión sobre las próximas reuniones. Dijo Jerome Powell en este discurso que la idea de que sería difícil volver a subir la tasa de interés después de una pausa no es correcta. Atención, repito, Jerome Powell dijo, la idea de que sería difícil volver a subir la tasa de interés después de una pausa no es correcta. Te está diciendo Jerome Powell que actualmente tenemos pausa de interés y algunas personas le están diciendo que eso es difícil de volver a subir. Él dice, no, eso no es correcto. Nosotros podemos subir la tasa más, los intereses.
Que es importante, el interés de Powell es bajar la inflación a un 2%.
Claro, para allá vamos, porque dijo también, es difícil traducir en cuántas subidas de tasas se traducen las condiciones financieras más estrictas. ¿Ok? Él te está diciendo ahí que es difícil de saber qué tantas veces tienen que subir los tipos de interés para provocar una catástrofe. ¿Ok? O sea que como que porque la gente lo que tiene es miedo de eso, como de que tú tanto suba y que venga un colapso. Bien, él dice que es difícil el saber eso. Entonces, también dijo Jerome Powell, en este momento no estamos pensando en recortes de tasas de interés en absoluto. Eso no se ha llevado a la mesa aparentemente, según lo que dice Jerome Powell, de que si pueden haber recortes. Eso no se ha hablado. Hasta ahora lo que han contemplado es en mantenerlo así, tal cual, pero de bajar nada, ¿ok? Dijo Jerome Powell también, Si lo consideramos necesario, endureceremos aún más la política monetaria. ¿Ok? Son palabras contundentes de Jerome Powell. Dijo también, hemos recorrido un largo camino con este ciclo de subida de tasas y estamos cerca del final del ciclo. ¿Ok? Y por último, también dijo Jerome Powell, las proyecciones de septiembre en las que indicamos tasas más altas en diciembre no son una promesa, avanzamos con cautela. Fíjate cómo en un momento Jerome Powell te dice, oye, no hemos considerado en ningún momento bajar las tasas, pero por otro lado, más adelante viene y te dice, lo que nosotros dijimos en septiembre de que en diciembre íbamos a subir las tasas, no son una promesa, o sea, no es algo 100% seguro. Ellos avanzan con cautela, es decir, avanzan según los datos. Por un lado te dicen no vamos a bajar, o sea, no sabemos si vamos a bajar, pero tampoco sabemos si vamos a subir. Te deja en el aire Jerome Powell. ¿Ok? Y por último, claramente las expectativas de inflación están en un buen lugar. A Jerome Powell le parece que vamos bien, que todo va según el plan. Yo también lo creo así. Yo no sé si usted cree que las cosas van por un buen camino según el objetivo, no según la economía, ¿ok? Pues la economía está de madra. Según el objetivo que se ha planteado la SEC de bajar la inflación a un 2%. Él está en un buen camino, actualmente está en un 5.5. Vamos a ver cómo transcurre todo. Dice aquí David Suárez, papi, me llama la atención que todas las altcoins están subiendo y BTC no. Gracias a Carlos por su traducción en español. Gracias, May. De nada, papi, estamos para eso. May, vendan solanas y compren memes. Yo me voy a volver tóxico ahora con vainita, con los ads, ¿eh? Porque miren, señores, miren. Déjame quitar esto ya. Voy a ponerlo así. ¿Esto qué es? BTC, miren. Señores, miren, ayer estábamos tirando unos cálculos macabros. Y esto es SATS, miren. Esto es SATS. Si SATS llega a esa línea amarilla, según los cálculos que estábamos tirando ayer, yo me meto $158,000 en los bolsillos. Si sube ahí. Mira, ahí.
Dime Solana, voy a comprar SATS.
Para eso SATS se tiene que comer 2-0. Hay que ver. Uno no sabe. La esperanza es lo último que se pierde. ¿Ok? Y me está gustando ver la reacción de SATS en la semanal. ¿Qué vamos a hacer? Está bonito y la esperanza está ahí. BTC, por otro lado, damas y caballeros, después del discurso de Jerome, vamos a poner aquí en la diaria una vela doji, una vela de indecisión. Seguimos sin saber para dónde va BTC. Sigue BTC en su rango, soportándose sobre la tendencial. Y eso es lo que hay. ¿Ok? Eso es lo que hay, mi gente. Pregunta aquí en el chat. ¿Cree usted que BTC va a romper a la baja o al alza? Déjenme saberlo aquí. ¿Qué le pareció el discurso de usted de Jerome Powell? ¿Más mareo sin decir nada? ¿O algo a lo cual se le puede sacar provecho? Dice, empezó a caer. Bueno, sin más mi gente, vamos a dejarlo aquí. Yo voy a programar 2 o 3 cositas más. Se han dado pares de operaciones, no me han agarrado muchas recompras, por eso no ha habido mucho profit, pero al final son positivas y es lo que se quiere. Así que nada, los quiero mucho mi gente y nos vemos en un próximo episodio. Les voy a dejar aquí el link del canal de Telegram para los que no están suscritos, que puedan entrar y suscribirse al canal a través del enlace de invitación. Nao está trabajando, yo creo, ahora mismo.
No lo veo.
Este es el enlace del canal de Telegram. Ahí está, pueden entrar y ser parte de la comunidad de MyCrypto. Miren qué lindo, BTC en la diaria se apoya, miren. Se apoya, rebota. Tenga usted mucho cuidado. Porque no crea usted que esto va a durar para toda la vida. Ese tremendo banderín que tiene BTC en 4 horas. Oh my God. Mira cómo va BTC en 1 hora. Liquidaron a todo el mundo y ahora vamos para liquidar lo que se metieron en short. BTC reaccionando, señores, en estos últimos minutos, después que finaliza el conversado de Jerome. Vamos a ver si BTC... Bueno, solo nos queda esperar. Damas y caballeros, gracias a todos por estar por aquí y compartir conmigo un momentito más. Nos vemos por ahí por Telegram. Chao, chao, Mickey Mouse.